All right, good morning and welcome to this week's edition of NCompass Live. I am your host, Krista Burns, here at the Nebraska Library Commission. NCompass Live is the Library Commission's weekly online event where we cover anything that may be of interest to librarians, any activities, topics, whatever. We do these sessions live every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Central Time. And they are recorded, however, so if you're unable to join us on Wednesday mornings, that's fine. You can watch all of our recordings that we have. We're in year 4, I believe, of the show. So there's a lot of good recordings and information out there that you can go ahead and watch. And we do all sorts of things here. We do book reviews, web tours, mini training sessions, anything we can come up with. Once a month, we do what we call our Tech Talk. Tech Talk with Michael Sauers, sitting next to me here.
Hello.
Michael is our technology innovation librarian here at the Nebraska Library Commission. And once a month he comes on the show and talks about the tech, what's happened in the last month in the tech news. I was going to say the day, but the month. Anything interesting, useful that he wants to bring to your attention. He also brings on people to interview or do presentations and whatnot. So that's what we have this morning for you is our monthly Tech Talk. So I'm just going to hand it over to Michael to introduce who he's got with us on the show today.
Great. Thanks, Krista. As regular listeners and watchers know, I try to bring in varying people to Tech Talk to try to talk about different projects they're working on, things they're doing in the libraries, that sort of thing. And for the last couple of months, one of the things we've been doing here at the Commission with our Nebraska Learns 2.0 program is we've had a thing, which is something you do, and then we've also had a book thing, which is something you read and write a little book report. You get some CE credit for that, and actually we had one turned in yesterday. Back about 2 months ago, I was lucky enough to be a speaker at the Massachusetts Library Association State Conference. And one of the other guests / speakers there was Andrew Blum, the author of Tubes, the book we have up there on the screen. And I listened to him talk, and it was a wonderful experience. We got to chat for a few minutes. I'll also throw in he was on a panel with John Scalzi. So, I mean, it was like really cool with the pair of them talking about technology and publishing and whatnot. And so I thought, why don't we try to tie some things together. So Tubes is going to be our August book thing, something you might want to read and earn some CE credit for. And so I also,
libraries.
CE credit for Nebraska librarians, going to specify that. So I also got on the Twitter machine and contacted Andrew and said, hey, would you be interested in being on our show? And he said yes. So, Andrew, I just want to welcome you to NCompass Live.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to briefly read his bio here to kind of give you a little bit of background of who he is, and actually that's going to lead me into my first question. Then he's going to do a short presentation, and then we'll kind of get into Q&A. But Andrew writes about architecture, design, technology, urbanism, art, and travel. Since 1999, his articles and essays have appeared in magazines such as Wired, the New York Times, Bloomberg Business Week, Gizmodo, The Atlantic Online, and Architectural Record. There's a broad selection there. He has degrees in literature from Amherst College and in human geography from the University of Toronto, and currently lives in New York City with his wife, daughter, and a black shepherd mix. So, Andrew, before I let you loose with your presentation, I just have one question based on that bio there. What is human geography?
Human geography, it's interesting. Geography was a long-time subject in lots of universities, but it kind of died in American universities, I think in the 60s and 70s, but lives on in a few places and in Canada, at the University of Toronto, where I did it, which it's kind of like, it's a little bit like urban studies, but not just cities. It's a little bit like philosophy, but only about places. It's a little bit like anthropology, but always through a spatial lens.
Wow, okay.
So for me it was a little bit of the philosophy of place and a little bit of kind of urban theory. I admit though I was somewhat of a failed graduate student. I only lasted a year. So.
Well, I got to say, if nothing else, it sounds really, really interesting. So, okay, I am switching over and giving you presentation control, and there's Andrew.
Here I am. Yes. Hi,
so, welcome again, and I'll let you go ahead and give your short presentation there, and then I've got tons of questions for you.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's fun to do it this way rather than traveling around sitting in my office doing it over the internet, my somewhat dirty office, excuse me. But so what I'll do, I'll talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, somewhere in between that, with some of the basics of the book and sort of how I approach this question of the physical infrastructure of the internet, and I guess then we'll talk. Yeah, keep going from there.
Okay. Sounds great.
Let me try to navigate this a little bit different. Okay, I'll put myself in the corner there. So as Michael described, I entered into this project having written mostly about architecture, about cities and buildings. And writing about architecture is based on a few certain assumptions. An architect designs a building and it becomes a place, or many architects design many buildings and they become cities. But regardless of the complexity of those places or those buildings, at the end of the day, you can always get up and go see them. You can always visit them. You can smell them. You can look at them. You can experience them. You can just get a sense for the amazing variety of their sense of place. And but what struck me over the last several years was that I was ostensibly writing about architecture, but was instead sitting right here all the time, actually literally right here in front of this laptop screen. And less was I going out and looking at buildings, and more I was being asked to sort of, look at the world only through the lens of my computer screen. And that was strange for a bunch of reasons. First of all, it was incredibly limiting. It was not really what made me want to write about architecture to begin with. I wanted to sort of be out there looking at things. But more striking to me was the fact that the world behind the screen seemed to have no physical presence of its own. My way of being in the world had changed so dramatically, so quickly. Suddenly I was always sort of half looking at the screen, and then even at the end of the day, sort of getting up and looking at the phone I carried in my pocket, and my attention was always divided like that. It was always sort of a half virtual world, a half physical world, or half real world, and yet, as real as the real world was, the virtual world seemed to have no physical reality of its own, and that seemed quite striking to me. And I kind of got hung up on that. It sort of amounted to a sort of low-grade existential crisis. So I realized that how could I understand myself if I didn't understand this world that I was connected to? And in fact, if you went and looked for images of the internet at all, if you punched in internet in your Google image search, or even opened up any book about the internet, I have a shelf full of them behind me, and all of them have essentially some variation of this image on the cover. The internet was always seen as this amorphous blob, this thing that was meant to be infinite, that you couldn't find yourself on anywhere, that was somehow meant to be sort of too large to comprehend. And it's always reminded me of the Apollo image, the blue marble image of the Earth, and sort of seems to suggest a kind of similar way of making us feel small, and this thing, the internet or the Earth, be seeming very majestic. But what was very clear was that this was not a real place. This was a sort of magical place. This was a kind of Milky Way, a sort of cyber Milky Way. What was striking was that I couldn't connect these two worlds I was living in, this physical world and this virtual world. There was no way to put the virtual world into a physical place. And then one day, this happened. My internet broke, and I have to admit the joke doesn't quite work as well as it does on the big screen, where where it looks as if my web page is broken. Here you get the full picture, and clearly it's a staged broken internet shot. But needless to say, my internet broke, and the cable guy came to fix it, and he followed this clump of wires from behind my couch and out to the front of my building and into the backyard. And then there was another big clump up against the outside wall, and then he saw a squirrel running along the wire, and he said, "I think that's your problem. I think that a squirrel is chewing on your internet." And of course, this seemed preposterous, because the internet wasn't something a squirrel could chew on. The internet was that amorphous blob. But sure enough, it did seem as if the internet really was being chewed on by a squirrel. And I quickly sort of got this image in my head of what would happen if you pulled the wire from the wall, if you sort of followed it. How far could I follow that wire? And what would I find? Was there a real physical infrastructure of the internet? out there, and it seemed like there had to be. But when I went looking for images of this physical infrastructure, when I kept going and sort of said, okay, what is this box? I felt like a fool. I was embarrassed because only fools went to actually look for the internet, and they find places like this black box, this tiny little thing with a red light on it, as represented in the sitcom The IT Crowd, where they convince their colleague that she can borrow the internet, this box, for an office presentation. And that normally it lives at the top of Big Ben because that's where you get the best reception. But they convince the elders of the internet that she's been doing such a good job at work that she can use it. And she looks at, she says, "This is the internet, the whole internet. Is it heavy?" And they all laugh at her and they say, "Oh no, of course not. The internet doesn't weigh anything." And this embarrassed me because I was the fool here. I was the one who was looking for this thing that supposedly didn't exist, and yet it does. Of course, there really is a physical infrastructure of the internet, and these are the places that I spent about 2 years visiting, and then I describe in tubes. So what I found there was remarkable. One of the most notable things was how comparatively little of it there was. The internet is a network of networks, right? And the key way that I looked at this was, what are the places where the networks connect to each other physically? One network connected to another. The router of a big refrigerator-sized thing with blinking lights and yellow cables of a Facebook or a Google or a Comcast or a Time Warner connected to the router, the big refrigerator-sized thing of another network, another one of these networks. And it turned out that there were about a dozen buildings in the world where more of these networks connected to each other than anywhere else. That were the sort of capitals of the internet, the sort of centers of the internet, the monuments of the internet. This is one of them. This is my favorite. This is 60 Hudson Street in Lower Manhattan, about a mile and a half from where I'm sitting right now. And it was originally built for Western Union as Western Union's telegraph center, but is now the place where the networks of the internet physically connect to each other. And in particular, about a half dozen very important networks, and those are the transatlantic cables, the undersea cables that connect the U.S. and Europe. They land most of them, not all of them, but most of them come up on the beach in Long Island or New Jersey, and then sort of home run, as they say, directly to the 9th floor of this building of 60 Hudson Street. And from there, they then interconnect with everybody else. And it's that physically specific, and this building has its own history and its own character and its own people working in it, and the specificity of that for me was really striking in contrast with the idea that, oh, the internet is packet switched, it all sort of just filters around through everywhere, and when we say it moves along many paths, we really are trying to say that it doesn't move along any, when that is unequivocally not true. There is always a distinct physical path. For me to you, I say that, I always put it that way. It's incredibly more resonant for me to be saying that to you when this presentation, of course, is traveling over the internet. I know what the first stop is. It's a Verizon central office on Flatbush Extension, about a half mile from here. Likely the second stop after that in this conversation might be 60 Hudson Street, or it might be 111 8th Avenue, another building in New York where many networks connect to each other. So along with these places where networks meet and networks connect with each other, these internet exchange points, I spent lots of time in data centers, places where data is stored, and we can talk about that. But I want to show some pictures, and specifically about another piece, in some ways the most poetic piece, and that's the undersea cables, these cables that connect continents. Which are, for me, kind of my favorite and by far the most poetic pieces of the internet. I mean, they're difficult. Well, in one dimension, you sort of hold them in your hand; they look like garden hoses. They've got a steel sort of exoskeleton and a copper tube that transmits power, that powers these big amplifiers that sit on the bottom of the ocean. These big, size of big bluefin tuna. And then at the core of them, the key piece are usually 6 or 8 hair-thin strands of fiber optic cable that that are filled with pulses of light. This is essentially Morse code at a nanosecond scale. And so if that physically, if you hold in your hand, that's quite easy to grasp. In the other dimension, they are almost impossible to comprehend because they stretch for 3 or 5 or 8,000 miles. And they are as big as the ocean. I mean, they are. This is the thing that connects us. If we think of the internet as a global medium, if we think of a global village in any way, these cables are the fundamental physical connection between us. This is the fundamental medium of that global village. And so how do they work? The light signals come from a house-sized thing called a landing station that's usually tucked away in a kind of seaside village. And then there's a manhole like this one. I can make it a little bit bigger, but where essentially this is on the coast of near Halifax, the coast of Nova Scotia. And what's striking is that this is the place, this is the singular spot where the cable ties up on shore. And it was amazing to me that, again, it's the opposite of this amorphous cloud, this amorphous blob. It is this incredibly specific, incredibly real piece of geography, of human geography, I guess you would say. And what's striking to me as well is the degree to which the sort of general picture of these cables is changing, that the internet is sort of unfinished. Across the Atlantic and the Pacific, the cables have been pretty consistent now for about 10 years. There was a generation of cables built 10 years ago, and that's pretty fixed. But there are now many new cables and many new connections, most remarkably new cables to Africa. 3 years ago, when I started thinking about this, there was one cable down the west coast of Africa, represented on by this little black line you probably can't even see. Now there are 6 active cables, 3 down each coast, and more to come. And that's an incredibly dramatic change. And the reason there's so many is because when a country gets one, it's not enough. They need to know that their connection is robust. Is that if something happens to it, if it's cut by an anchor or an underwater landslide or something like that, and if it is cut, you need to send a ship out, throw a grappling hook over the side, pick up one end of the cable, pick up the other, and fuse them together. They need to know that if obviously not a fast process. They need to know that their connection is secure in order to begin to build businesses around it. And the same might be said as well of rural connections. One isn't enough. We often need a certain amount of redundancy. So one of the things that I really, again, if my quest was to visit the physical infrastructure of the internet, one of the things I really wanted to do was watch one of these cables being built. It just seemed to me the sort of most precise, the most specific moment of connection. We talk all the time about these fleeting sort of virtual adjacencies, but it seemed to me that a new cable connecting a continent was a really intense moment of physical connection. And this guy, Simon Cooper, was the guy who was going to let me do that. He works for a company called Tata, which is the communications wing of Tata, the big Indian industrial conglomerate. I've never met him. I guess he like I today sort of lives inside the internet, and I talked to him on this big video conferencing system, and he treats the sort of geography of the world as if it's his front lawn, and he says things like this: they had bought a cable system, an existing cable system out of bankruptcy, for a song, and then added pieces onto it until they had a continuous cable around the world, and then once they had that, they started building new cables north and south, and that was one of those new cables, a cable from Lisbon down the west coast of Africa, called the WAX cable, the West Africa Cable System, was the one that I wanted to see being built. So Simon said, he said, oh yes, we do have this new cable building. You're coming. You're welcome to watch it. We'll let you know when it happens. And so with about 4 days' notice, he said to go to this beach south of Lisbon, and a little after 9 on a Monday morning, this guy will walk out of the water. And this is what he was doing, was carrying a messenger line, the first connection between sea and land that would then be leveraged into this 8,000-mile path of light from Europe down the west coast of Africa. It would then unfold over the next few days. It was this incredible process of actually pulling the cable on shore from this cable-laying ship, this specialized ship, floating it on these orange buoys until it's in position. And then once it is in position, then the guy in the wetsuit goes back into the water with a big knife and cuts each buoy off, and the buoy pops up into the air, and the cable drops to the ocean floor. And when he gets out to the ship, he does this sort of whole kilometer out to the ship swimming, and when he gets there, they give him a glass of juice and a cookie, and then he jumps back into the water and he swims back, and then when he gets back on the beach, he lights a cigarette. And then they get to work essentially preparing to attach the cable from the ship to another cable that has been brought down from the landing station. And they do that by hacking away at the, until they get to the fibers underneath. But what's so remarkable to me is that if we think of the internet as a cloud, and we sort of think of it as this amorphous thing, when you see these guys hacking away at it with a hacksaw, that starts to seem a lot less the case. It starts to seem like an incredibly physical thing. And that was exciting for me. I mean, this hacksaw moment sort of proved that indeed the internet does exist. It is something you can touch. And one thing that was remarkable to me as well is that, again, this is a human geography thing, but if the technology is incredibly sophisticated, incredibly advanced, the basic physical connections are actually quite familiar. They've been around essentially unchanged for 100 years. Here's the same process of a telegraph cable being laid in the 20s in Asia, and it's the same places. These cables connect classic port cities, places like Lisbon or Mombasa or Mumbai or New York or Singapore. And it's the same culture. It's the local laborers. It's always these English engineers. You can see them in the picture before. You can see the guy in the hat back there. So the things that tie us together, that the technology has changed, but the basic patterns have not. And then what was at the end of this sort of 3-day process of making this physical connection between continents, it kind of looked like this. There was a manhole and a cable coming out of the manhole. And then when it was over, they put the manhole cover back on and they pushed the sand back over the top, and everybody in this village and all of us forgot about it. It's under the sand. It's literally buried. And that seems to me not the way it should be. Every time we talk about the cloud, and every time we put something on the cloud, we give up some responsibility for it. We don't know where it is. And that seems risky to me. That makes me uncomfortable. And there's a great Neil Stephenson line where he says that wired people should know something about wires, and that's something that I take seriously as well. We should know where our internet comes from, and we should know what this thing is that physically connects all of us. And that's really the sort of the answer, both the question and the answer that I set out to explore in Tubes. So there's lots more to talk about, but that's a sort of basic intro to the way that I think about this physical infrastructure of the internet and what it means to me.
Andrew, thank you. That was wonderful introduction. I think that almost raised every single thing I wanted to ask you about. Although Krista had a comment right off the top. I agree with her, but go ahead.
No, you said that you don't think that that's how it should be with that manhole covered by the sand, and I think you meant that we don't realize that it's there and that it's a changeable thing. Yeah. I said, well, it keeps the squirrels away at least.
It does keep the squirrels away. Exactly. And the squirrels are always a problem. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure how many African beach squirrels there are, but anyways. All right, so
wombats.
Yeah, I went through your book. I read it on the way back from Massachusetts, and then I read it again a couple of weeks ago, and went through with sticky notes, and so lots of things I want to talk to you about. I think where I'll start is that I think even with all the experience I have with the internet, I a lot of people view me as technical, but I don't configure routers and things like that any bigger than what's in my house. But you seem to do in a couple of places in the book some what I would want to call maybe myth busting. One is with the title and Senator Ted Stevens, and it's not a big truck, it's a series of tubes, and to which you reply, but the one thing it most certainly is nearly everywhere is in fact a series of tubes. And later in the book, you mention about Al Gore saying something along the lines of inventing the internet, and you pretty much said it isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. How was it kind of remembering those stories and then doing the research and going, well, you know what, maybe they weren't that wrong?
I mean, that was Yeah, well, I remember. I mean, when Ted Stevens said that, it seemed. I mean, yes, it was pretty funny because he obviously was pretty clueless about how the internet worked and what it was made of, and that was shocking because at the time he was head of the Senate, Commerce, Technology, and Transportation Committee. So he was the one responsible for legislating this.
Mm-hmm.
But it was but I also realized that a lot of my tech journalist colleagues, certainly a lot of people in the kind of web world, in the web startup world, believe in the kind of magic of it to the extent that they stop seeing it as a piece of infrastructure. They take it for granted entirely, and a lot of and I was that was for me, it was the desire to get past that was partly practical, but partly sort of philosophical. So I look at the world in terms of places. It's one of the reasons I studied geography. One of the reasons I was writing about architecture is that I liked that's how I thought of the world. And yet this major thing, this thing that dominated our lives, was meant to be excluded from that world. We were meant to not. It was meant that place world was meant to be not relevant to the online world that we all spent so much of our time. And so I did want to sort of bust the myth that the internet is this incredibly amorphous, non-existent, physically non-existent thing, and that was the tubes part was quite easy because anytime you sort of go and you visit one of these data centers, internet exchange points, or cable landing stations, you're surrounded by these metal conduits, and we can argue about the difference between a conduit and a tube, but I think I think there isn't much of one. It's a metal cylinder through which things travel, and that's about the end of it. I did hear from Ted Stevens. Ted Stevens died in a plane crash about 2 years ago, but I did hear from his family just recently, and they have a sense of humor about it. They were both reassured. They were excited that I had done something to redeem his this major gaffe, but they also they have a sense of humor about it. They have their home Wi-Fi network, they said, is named Nugget Tubes. And the tubes part is obviously in honor of Ted, of his gaffe. The Nugget part is their cockapoo named Nugget.
Yeah, okay, well, that's good. Well, it shows you're having an impact when, senators' families are calling you about that.
Right.
So let's...
Talking about their cockapoos.
Yeah. So let's talk about geography a minute. You touched upon this on especially with that one the photo of the laying of the telegraph cable. Sorry, geez, old technology already. And you mentioned a couple places that these tubes, these cables come in at port cities, and it kind of also you align it or analogize it with the international flights and kind of the hub and spoke of airports coming in. Why, maybe just if you could expand upon why the cables are where they are, why these buildings are where they are from maybe a historical perspective.
Yeah, sure. That was often my first question, why is this here? Why is the internet here and not someplace else? And the answer, there were always basically two answers. There was some fact of geography. There was some sort of broader macro reason. In the case of 60 Hudson in Lower Manhattan, it is lower. It's kind of the exact elbow of Lower Manhattan, which has always been an important spot for telecommunications, and the first way out of town, the Holland Tunnel, or another very important building for the internet in the U.S., a building in Ashburn, Virginia, near Dulles Airport, owned by a company called Equinix. The Virginia suburbs there have always been an important part of the telecommunications and military-industrial complex of the U.S., so it's not that surprising. But along with that fact of geography, there's always a charismatic salesperson. There's always some guy who convinced the first two networks to come to this place, and then because those two networks were there, all the others followed after. And that's pretty striking to me. I mean, it's the fact that the internet, the dominant sort of character of the internet, is that it's a network of networks, but more than that, it's each network operating autonomously, making its own individual decisions, and yet entirely dependent on its connections to other networks. So there's a real kind of balance between that, between a network, doing what's best for it, but recognizing that no network on the internet is an island. Every network on the internet is only relevant in so much as it's connected to all the other networks. And so, so you need that kind of balance. You need to be connected to others, and that sort of human part of it becomes very important.
Thanks. Okay. The next question I have for you is something that it was funny. Whenever I was reading your book, I'd say it was well written because I would always kind of anticipate where you were going next. And like I'd have this question, and then 3 paragraphs later you'd answer it.
Thank you.
And I love it when that happens when I'm like teaching a workshop myself. And very early on in the book, I started to think about security issues. And then immediately you quote an engineer that says, all this talk about homeland security, but look what someone could do in here with a chainsaw. And someone else later in the book you quote as saying, are we creating through this book a roadmap for terrorists? I mean, I don't want to be completely paranoid here or anything like that, but something I kept thinking where some people might look at this and say, yeah, you're telling everybody what's at 60 Hudson Street. Now they have a target. How are you kind of dealing with those issues internally or with the book? Oh,
yeah, it's been an interesting road, and in some ways a kind of unremarkable one. Well, for example, a piece of the book I write in the book about this complex of buildings in Virginia owned by Equinix Ashburn, and that section of the book was excerpted on Gizmodo, the website. And with the title, which I meant to be sensational, of the bullseye of America's internet, and we drew a map with red concentric circles around the satellite image of these buildings. And Equinix, the company that owns these buildings, proceeded in the sort of 2 weeks following the publication of that article to tweet, every 2 hours, "We are the bullseye of America's internet. We are the bullseye of America's internet." Because that's their business, they all they want is for everyone to acknowledge that their piece of the internet is by far the most important. And the general consensus is that, well, first of all, because of that sort of publicness that I talked about a minute ago, that the sort of way in which networks need to connect to each other physically, and therefore they need to know where each other are, they need to know the best places to connect to each other. Because of that publicness, there's always, the locations are always out there if you know how to look for them. And the refrain that I kept getting from network engineers and from the owners of these buildings was, first of all, they're not hidden. If you enter in the name of the building into Google Maps, a big red flag drops in the middle of it. And second of all, the greater risk to the internet is not through its sort of malicious physical destruction through some sort of terrorist attack, but the greater risk to the internet is that we, and most especially, I suppose, Ted Stevens' colleagues in Washington, don't understand what it is well enough in order to properly legislate it. And so the knowing about the internet is more important than keeping it hidden, when in fact it isn't really hidden anyway. It's not discussed, but the lack of discussion isn't deliberate. The lack of discussion is part of this sort of fantasy of the cloud. So there hasn't, 60 Hudson, for example, everybody, there have been lots of things written about that building. Everybody knows it's there. It's quite well secured, and yet it needs, yet there's a commercial intent on the part of its owners and operators that they want to talk about how important it is, and there's also a sort of basic, kind of basic physical reality to it that it's a big building, and doing something to it would not take the internet down. It would slow things down a little bit, but it would not take the internet down. And it would be difficult, and you would be perceived as trying to take down the global economy. Everyone sort of acknowledges that they are not good targets, and they are no worse targets if we keep them hidden. On the contrary, they become, by keeping them hidden and obscured, we aren't as ready to discuss the future of the network and to make sure that it is in fact not just secured but redundant and robust.
Great. So let's get technical for just a moment, or at least a little more technical. One of the sections of your book, you talk about the concept of peering. Can you just kind of explain that briefly, which I think will lead me into a follow-up question there?
Yeah, no, peering is the kind of it's sort of my favorite concept from the book. And it's based on the same idea that no network on the internet is a network on the internet is nothing without its connections to other networks, and those connections, sort of loosely stated, are known as peering connections. You connect with another network, perhaps as a peer, meaning my network is the peer of your network, or perhaps it's not the peer at all. Perhaps one network is much bigger and you get much more out of connecting to them than they get out of connecting to you, and then so you have to pay them a bit. So then that's a paid peering connection. But it's so it's what's striking is that it's a very complicated, the kind of subtleties of who's paying whom and why one network is connected to another is a very sort of complicated kind of diplomatic art form. It's all about figuring out how best to move your traffic, and if you're a major network on the internet, and even more striking, that process is not automatic at all. If you load a web page and it feels as if the internet all sort of happens magically and automatically, it's only because these two peering coordinators have gone to a conference together, most likely the NANOG conference, North American Network Operators Group, and we talk about going to conferences to network. They literally talk about going to conferences to network, and had a few beers and decided the other peering coordinator is clueful, which is the opposite of clueless, and then actually made the decision to connect their networks, a decision that's then sort of physically consummated in one of these buildings with a yellow fiber optic cable running from my router to your router, from one router of one network to the router of another network. So peering is the verb for the inter and internet.
Okay, actually I'm going to ask a different question I had, and then I'll ask my follow-up, because okay. I remember when you mentioned a color there. And I remember when I get the internet hooked up and I have a cable or a DSL modem and it's connected to my router and they gave me a yellow cable. Is there a reason they're yellow?
No. Well, the basic. I wish I had one here. The basic unit, the most sort of fundamental unit of these major connections is a yellow fiber optic jumper cable, and the yellow signifies I forget which one. It's I think it's a single mode fiber. The yellow signals the kind of fiber that's inside of it. And when it's like bird watching. When you visit the internet enough, you can start to tell the difference between these different cables and which ones are copper and which ones are single mode fiber and which ones are dual mode fiber or multi-mode fiber. And so, but most often, it's 10 gigabit per second waves of light through yellow fiber optic jumper cables. So yeah.
Okay, hey, that's more information than I had before. So kind of back to the kind of back to peering a little bit. You talked in the book about peering. You talked about at one point where two major networks sort of de-peered from each other, and so whole sections of the internet to some people seem to get a heck of a lot slower. And you also mentioned at one point that because of peering, the example you gave is suddenly Facebook seems to load faster than almost everything else. And when I read that, the phrase that popped into my head was network neutrality. And I guess so kind of what are your opinions on that, also relating to, though, now that we have a better understanding of peering, doesn't that really have a direct effect on the concept of network neutrality?
Yeah, I mean this is what's interesting. When I started thinking about this about 3.5 years ago, I did what journalists do, which is I sort of called the people in Washington who are the loudest voices about internet policy and network neutrality, and sort of started asking questions about how the internet worked. And the answers I got seemed fishy. They seemed to not sort of match what I had heard otherwise, particularly from the network engineering community. And in fact, what's striking to me, and I'll put it pretty bluntly, is that the political conversation about network neutrality is about the internet as it existed 5 or 10 years ago. And the structure of the internet has evolved in a way that makes the current political conversation less and less relevant. Which is to say, if the basic sort of phrase we use about network neutrality is is that there shouldn't be fast lanes on the internet. But in fact, it's all fast lanes. It's all about network engineers trying to make as direct a connection as possible. So that means that Facebook doesn't have a big data center where the internet comes and plugs into them. Facebook runs its own global data network with the idea that it is best capable, that is the way to move its traffic as efficiently and quickly as possible. And then Facebook has pops up literally in about a dozen buildings around the world where they then will interconnect with your network. And so, and that direct interconnection is good for Facebook. It's good for the ISPs because it sort of might reduce their overall bandwidth bill, from the cost of getting to the rest of the internet, as if they're, by connecting directly to Facebook, by sort of minimizing that middleman. So yeah, so it becomes, and same thing with videos, with a service like Hulu or Netflix. Hulu and Netflix both spend a lot of money to make sure that their connections to your ISPs are as direct and literally direct, lacking intermediaries as possible, in order that their video looks better than a competitor. And so where does that leave? Where does that that leaves the conversation about network neutrality in a strange place, because it assumes some sort of sort of platonic ideal of a public internet that by no means exists anymore. So when you ask me, my opinions on network neutrality are evolving. I certainly don't think that the way it's phrased now is the right way for it to be phrased. I certainly don't think the ISPs should have any control over what we, should limit our control over the internet we receive. But at the same time, if I try to watch a Netflix video on a weekend night in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, it often doesn't work because, essentially the tubes are clogged. And would I be willing to pay an extra $2 or $3 a month to be guaranteed a direct connection to Netflix? When as a yes, I mean, that's something I might be willing to pay for. That's something that might both provide better service to me as a consumer, and also might acknowledge the fact that everybody pays on the internet. The Netflix pays, Cablevision pays, Comcast pays, and at the moment, though, we don't have any sense of the parts and pieces of the internet. We have no transparency into how those parts and pieces fit together. And without that transparency, without that knowledge, I don't think we're talking about net neutrality in an effective way.
Great. Let me ask you a question, maybe kind of bigger picture. One other story that you mentioned when you were visiting, I believe it was the Netherlands. One of the things we deal with a lot, especially here in Nebraska, is connectivity in rural areas and getting that. Yeah. Last mile, whatever you want to call it, getting that connection out to where there aren't a lot of people, and the internet seems to congregate where there are a lot of people, which makes some sense. The story you shared, you mentioned that a law in one of the countries stipulated that if a company wished to dig to lay new cable or anything like that, they had to announce their intentions and allow others to lay their own fiber and share the cost of construction, which smacks of socialism to me, but and I'm not against that. But in having learned all this and done all this research, like I said, very big picture question. What do you see as something that might or should be done here in the U.S. to improve the connectivity? I know our speeds are not nearly what they are in a lot of other countries. Our connectivity is not nearly. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations as to what you think should happen to improve that here in the States?
Yeah. A few. I mean, well, I should say, Tubes as a book, as you know, is entirely descriptive. It's not prescriptive at all. But of course, I've been thinking about, I've been thinking recently. I've been talking more and more about what I think could change. And I mean, the key thing and the biggest thing is more competition. At the moment. Competition at different levels. At the moment, we have almost no choice over provider. If you're in a big city, maybe you have one cable company and one phone company, and those are the two options. But not only that, at the wholesale level, there is very little competition at what's known as the middle mile. So if you wanted to, which is the connection essentially between a single locality, a sort of smaller town or small city, or even medium-sized city, and the sort of the backbone of the internet, the places where the sort of the whole where you can buy a wholesale connection to the internet, known as internet transit, and that piece is called the middle mile. And when you talk to people who are thinking about starting up small ISPs, if what you begin to hear is that yes, it costs a lot to lay cable out to people's homes, particularly in rural areas. But the other piece of it is the cost of, and this is the piece that's more relevant to the speeds that we get, but is the wholesale cost of connecting to the rest of the internet. And that's limited as well. That's limited by even more so by the incumbent telecoms control over these middle mile pieces, over the connection from essentially from anywhere to an NFL city. Or maybe NFL with maybe another 10 cities on there. So if you're not, if you can't get there, then you can't connect to the wholesale level to the internet, and you're even more constrained. So aside from the whole sort of regulatory framework, you're even more constrained from offering an alternative to a sort of competitive ISP. And again, because of that plays out in different ways. There's a great movement for community networks, not just wireless networks, but sort of community-owned or cooperative ISPs. I don't know a whole lot about this. You probably know more, but based on particularly in the Midwest, on the tradition of rural telcos, of the original CLECs, things like that. But in some states, in Wisconsin, for example, AT&T is fighting to to make them illegal. Essentially making it illegal to start a competitive ISP, rather than trying to let as many flowers bloom and provide give us more choices from where we get our internet, or by making it easier, more accessible. The rural issues are more complicated, but I was struck. I was in Portland, Oregon, and in Portland, you can buy artisanal everything. They obsess over the smallest things. And it's not just a joke. Over what farms the chickens come from, and who's the best artisanal pencil sharpener in town. And yet, when you ask a room full of people in Portland where they get their internet from, the answer is Comcast. It's just as shocking that it's almost like where does food come from? The grocery store. We haven't begun to sort of ask. You can think of it almost in Starbucks terms. We haven't begun to ask for we haven't begun to distinguish between a cup of coffee and a latte. When it comes to the internet, we haven't begun to sort of know the parts and pieces well enough to begin to ask for more parts and pieces. That doesn't entirely address the rural issue, but I think certainly the dominant power of the incumbent cable companies and telcos is the opposite of the sort of the inherent sort of kind of democratic interconnectivity at the heart of the internet more broadly. I mean, the thing that makes me most nervous about the internet, whether at the backbone or at the ISP level, is any single network getting too large, and that means companies like Comcast and Google are, for me, the kind of ones that are the sort of the biggest threat to the future health of the internet.
Great. Just want to remind everybody, if you've got any questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A area or raise your hand in GoToWebinar, and we'll happily turn on your mic for you. Got a couple more questions for you regarding the book, kind of short ones, and then one last larger picture question.
It may run a little.
Yeah, and I think folks for listening live will probably run a little long here. What was your favorite place to visit?
I think my favorite single place, I think, was two places. Well, I guess, do I have to choose one? Okay, two quickly. One was Facebook's data center in Prineville, Oregon. Partly because, first of all, it's a kind of, Central Oregon's a beautiful place, and it was Facebook's data center was one of the best examples that I found of this kind of impulse to monumentalize the internet. To sort of celebrate this physical infrastructure. The Facebook's data center, it's quite a beautiful building. It's a building that they've put a lot of care into into sort of every square inch of it. And more striking than that is speaking again to this the sort of supposed invisibility of it. Facebook has embraced the town it's in, Prineville, and Prineville, the town, has embraced Facebook and has really seen the infrastructure as a direct replacement for for the industry that was lost there. Otherwise, primarily the timber industry. And that was quite striking to me, and it made the place a sort of particularly vivid example of the Internet's infrastructure. I won't tell you the second one. We can stop there.
Okay, no, that works. Was there any place you wanted to visit or thing you wanted to see that you were just unable to get to, or add, or denied access, or what was the thing you missed?
Well, that's the other half of the Facebook equation. The other big data center in Oregon, which was Google's data center. Google and Facebook made the same decision about 5 years apart, which is to put their first ground-up data center, their first sort of factory-sized data center in essentially the same place in Oregon. And my visit to Google's data center sort of played out like farce. And I had, I invited myself over. They sort of said, okay, sure, but then proceeded to essentially give me a tour of the parking lot, and did not answer any questions whatsoever about what was inside the building or how it worked, and instead sort of served me this, their famous delicious lunch, and had invited a handful of Googlers to tell me, literally, please tell Andrew how much you like working at Google, as if kicked under the table by the press person who was accompanying me. And yes, I was disappointed not to know how a Google data center works. They're supposed to be quite sophisticated. But more than that, I was sort of shocked by the hypocrisy that the company that knows the most about us is least willing to tell me, and by extension readers and all of you, anything about itself. And for reasons of, they say, privacy and competition. But by the time I visited Google, I'd been to dozens and dozens of these data centers, and everybody had sort of welcomed me in and said, it's really great that we want to make sure you understand this. It's really great we're talking about this. And Google was by far the outlier. And that attitude, that sort of purr of like, oh, don't worry about this. We'll take care of it for you. Your data is ours now. You needn't worry about it anymore. Was pretty terrifying. And all the more striking coming from the ultimate sort of information company.
Yeah, I remember reading about that, and yeah, farce was about the best way to put it. That was a little ridiculous. Yeah. Okay, last question about the book. In all of your research, what was the single most surprising or oddest or funniest thing you learned that the one thing that sticks out that you had no clue going in, and out the back end you're like, wow, I didn't know that.
For me, I mean, it was quite striking again and again how small the internet was, how few people were involved, how sort of small the community was of network engineers who are involved in the interconnection of networks that we all depend on, and the intimacy of that was really shocking, given this, again, this sort of expansiveness with which we really think about the internet. So for example, I was talking to people at Microsoft. And Microsoft is a company of 90,000 employees around the world, and there are 200 people involved with running Microsoft's global network, their global data network. Of those 200 people who run Microsoft's global data network, 5 of them are involved in the interconnection of Microsoft's network with all the other networks of the internet. A tiny number, and that's a good, that's a sort of good anecdotal sense of what I saw directly, which was that essentially there are about 300 or 400 people around the world who are dominantly involved with the interconnection of networks of the internet, who keep the internet and not just a single net. And that was the sort of thickness of that social network never ceased to amaze me.
Yeah, wow. 5 people in all of Microsoft. Wow. Okay, so let me just switch gears here with kind of one last question / topic. In the world of libraries, we're dealing a lot with changes in publishing and ebooks and digital rights management. And I'm a published author myself. Krista will be next year. Yes. Oh, book coming out. Okay, sorry.
I had a chapter in a thing.
Chapter in a book. Oh, okay. Anyways, we have full. Anyways, so I like to talk to other authors kind of briefly about, you've published this book. I don't know, but I'm assuming there's an electronic copy of it, and if so, I'm assuming there's a free electronic copy out there, whether you like it or not. where are you from kind of an authorial standpoint of moving from print to digital, licensing, DRM, access to materials, that sort of thing? It's a pretty wide open question.
Yeah, I don't have great answers to it, I'm afraid. I mean, I'd say a few things. Well, first, I mean, yes, the Tubes is available on all digital platforms, on Kindle, on Nook, on Google Books, on Kobo around the world, and for me, what I wrote, I wrote a book, but I didn't write a book. I wrote about 77,000 words, and those 77,000 words, existed, are the, regardless of what physical form they're in, are for me the story, and that's sort of what I produced, and interestingly, that's contractually what I was supposed to produce. I was supposed to deliver about 75,000 words. I wasn't supposed to deliver a book. I was supposed to deliver the words. So I'm somewhat agnostic about what media those words take. I should say though, I'm a full-time author. I make my living as an author. I make my living from magazine articles and from the future sales of books, and this project could only happen. It could only have happened thanks to essentially what's essentially a venture capital model of publishing. My publishers, sort of essentially, fronted the money to take these trips on the assumption that people would then buy the books, 2 or 3 years later. And that's dependent on a book is published by Echo, which is an imprint of HarperCollins, which is a division, or soon to be a separate division of News Corporation owned by Rupert Murdoch. This is sort of corporate publishing at its biggest. But I know, I can say unequivocally that the book would not exist were it not for that structure, and another book like it would not exist if there weren't still people willing, still libraries willing to to pay $27 or $16 or $14 for a copy of that book in some form or another. So what it takes, if that can be, the DRM is less, the DRM, I think, I think we can do without it. The pirated copies sort of really get me. I feel that quite, I feel that quite explicitly as theft. And I understand I want as many people to read it as possible, and that's why I wrote it, to be read. But it's but the future of I cannot, I will not be able to write future books if people don't buy this one. So it's a complicated question. The economics of it are very present for me, and I know very present for my publisher as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I just more wanted your opinion and thoughts more than anything else. So,
no, that's that, and I should say, I mean, I wish, in some ways politically, I wish I could say something different, but practically, practically, it's quite straightforward. So.
Yeah, and I can say maybe I don't make my living off my writing, so maybe that influences my opinion. I don't know there. So.
Absolutely.
All right. Well. Andrew, is there anything else you'd like to add or say, or we've kind of gotten through my questions? We haven't gotten any in from the audience.
No. If you have any questions, type them into your questions section of your interface. We can pass them on.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean only how much I've always worked partly in libraries, and it was great. It sort of came home to me at both at the Massachusetts Library Convention where we met, but also in traveling around to different libraries to present Tubes. It's what a key part of the process. What a key. It's so obvious to somebody say it out loud, but what a key venue for readers libraries are, readers of books in particular. So.
Well, we appreciate those thoughts. Definitely. Andrew, I want to thank you very much for this. This was wonderful. I got to say, after you agreed to do this interview, and then I saw you were going to be on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, I got really nervous about doing this interview. This was wonderful and quite the experience for me, and I really appreciate it. So,
thank you guys for having me. I'm glad. Thanks for everyone for taking the time today as well.
All right, we're going to go ahead and take back control of the presentation because I just have a couple of odds and ends to cover that I usually do in the Tech Talk here. And in this case, I believe I just have 2 or 3. Krista has been adding some bookmarks as we're going along to some of the things that I mentioned. We found the Gizmodo article.
Yes.
And those will all be in the show notes as we go along. But I have a few other kind of news items that I want to briefly talk about. And those will also be linked to in the show notes, so you don't need to write down any URLs or anything. Both of which are security related that have happened in the last couple of weeks. And this first one was earlier this month. Some Yahoo services got hacked, and some 450,000 plus passwords got released. So once again, we are here to remind you to use good passwords. If you do have a Yahoo password and you haven't changed it recently, now would be a really good time. If you're using that same password on other services, go change your password on the other services. We have done whole sessions just on security and passwords and whatnot. You can find those in the archives if you're looking for suggestions as to how you can come up with a good password. The other one, this was actually mentioned in Blake's session on security, a while back, on IT security, about when he would talk to librarians about what do they do when they find a dropped USB stick in the library.
Someone left their USB behind or something, yes.
Librarians will just pick them up and plug them into a computer to see whose they were. And this is from Bruce Schneier. He's a security expert. I read his blog on a regular basis. And studies have shown that actually criminals, for lack of any other term, are actually intentionally dropping USB sticks in company parking lots, hoping somebody will pick it up and plug it into their computer and allow their computer to be accessed by people who are not supposed to be, or sending spam or things like that. So I guess I just want to stress what Blake said. If you find a USB stick in your library, please do not plug it into anything. Just, if you want to keep it for in case somebody calls, they can probably identify it physically. Just please don't plug it into anything.
And this is very interesting that people always think of hacking to be as we were just talking about, a internet thing. It comes in through your firewall, through your computer. This is a physical, low-tech.
This is sneaker net.
And it works.
Yep, it does.
So, yeah, be aware. And, don't plug them in. Besides the fact of it could be something malicious, whether on purpose or on accident.
Right.
It also falls to the privacy issue.
Yeah, you could say there might be some privacy issues if you start looking for identifying information on that flash drive.
Inside of it, yes.
There might be some privacy issues that you're running into as a library. So, just sometimes you just rather not know things, and I think this would be it. So my 2 updates at this point are security related. Although, you know what, I'm going to throw in one more thing real quick here. I'm going to go to Google. I found this out this morning. Google just added a new feature. If you type in calculator into Google, you actually now get an online integrated calculator, which does 3D graphing and all sorts of other things. So instead of typing calc into the start menu, you can go to Google and type in calculator, and it comes up.
And that's new today, right?
I saw a blog post. I think it was written late last night, so it happened yesterday or today. So we'll throw that in too.
Cool, fun thing.
So that's it for me at this point.
Sure. Hop over to there.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for attending this morning and sticking with us. We ran a late. Thank you, Andrew, for being on the show. That was a great session. We hope to join us next week, if you want to click on the one for next week's show, where we just announced this yesterday. It was a last-minute thing, yes. NL's Tech Rodeo Roundup, starting as tomorrow. Tomorrow afternoon. A group of librarians and some staff here at the commission are going out to Doane College in Crete and having our Library Commission Tech Rodeo, which I know Michael, you want to do a short little, because you are one of the. I'm one of the people running that dog and pony show. Basically, we're bringing in a lot of these scholarship students and practicing librarians from across the state, and there's about 40 of us.
and we're going to be spending Thursday afternoon to Saturday afternoon on campus, staying in the dorms.
Yes.
And we've broken the attendees up into teams, and each team has been given a scenario. And by the end of the experience, each team will have been taught how to and will have produced a short oral presentation as if they were going to take their project to some funders, a screencast to teach people how to use whatever they would create in their scenario, and an actual 3 to 5 minute promotional video promoting their project that they will be coming up with. We've got flip cams and video editing software and all sorts of fun stuff. So we've never done anything like this before. It is going to be an experience in all way, shape, and form. Luckily, it sounds like it won't be 100 degrees outside. And so next Wednesday's show, we'll have some people who participated.
We're going to be inviting some of the participants to come and talk about their experience. So join us next week to hear what they have to say, to learn about this new cool thing that we did for scholarship students. So hopefully we'll have a bunch of them on the show and sharing about how it went, along with the people running it. Michael, Laura Johnson, and Catherine Brockmeyer from here at the Library Commission are putting on this event.
Yep.
So join us for that for next week. As I said, we just announced it yesterday, so it is a new one. You might not have heard about it before, but definitely go in and register for it and join us next week. Also, as you can see here, if you want to, you can click on it, I suppose. We do have a Facebook page for NCompass Live. Feel free to like us on Facebook, and you will get all your information about what's coming up on our upcoming shows that way as well. So we announce it there. We announce it on Twitter. We do it through our mailing list, but we have a Facebook page as well that you can now follow and know what's going on. So thank you very much for attending, and we don't seem to have any questions or comments coming in, so we will wrap it up for this morning and say thank you, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.